Okay.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yes. So, got it. Yes. So let me share my screen, please. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining today's session. So today is Baku Power BI and Modern Excel User Meetup Group's 16th session. And Baku Power BI and Modern Excel User Meetup Group is just trying to make every event very useful on behalf of its attendees and members, subscribers. Recently, we have some speakers like Shabnam, Kasper Kameshe, Ken Pals, Ragati Jane, Claudia, and also Karin from different parts of the world. And I also would like to give a little bit information about the new things in Excel world. So first of all, I would like to begin with the books. Ken Pals, whom I call as a father of Power Query, has published his new book. Actually, this is he just let's say refreshed his books, and you may get this book from different sources, specifically from skillwave.training, and also Reza Rat and Leila Itaiti from New Zealand. They has written new books. It's also, these books also are related to Power Query, and you may see on my screen the names of those books, and you can get these books from Amazon. And also, I would like to give a little bit of information about the Bangladesh Excel Summit, which is going to take place in next month, October, and where I'm also, or I will talk about Power Query fundamentals in Excel. Also, I would like to give a good information for my attendees. And actually, I was trying to get a good scholarship for my attendees. So we agreed with Radakat, with Lele Itaiti, and also Reza Rat. So as of today, we'll have an opportunity to give to one of our subscribers or attendees 1 month free subscription to Radakat. Actually, I'm not going to do it randomly. I will, I'm just always trying to keep under observation the attendees. So I will, for the first time, select myself. So I will give this opportunity to a person who really enjoys Baku Power BI and the Modern Excel User Meetup Group session. So as for today's speaker, we have Oakley Turvey from London, from England, who is going to talk about understanding data visualization, aggregation, and filters. I hope Oakley, in his turn, will give the necessary information about the topic, about the issue. And as for next speakers, the busy schedule for next month is waiting for us. Yes, so our next speaker is Chris Webb from Microsoft on October 80th. And after Chris Webb, we'll have Deborah Ashby, with whom I met on goldskills.com platform. And she will be talking about PowerPoint. And after Deborah Ashby, we'll have Reza Durrani from United States, who will talk about Power Apps and Power Automate. So I strongly believe that you will enjoy this course. Thank you for your attendance and enjoy the session. I believe that we're gonna meet on October 18th, 2021. So Oakley, stage is yours. I'm just going to stop sharing. So here you are.
Thank you. I'll share my screen.
Okay, please.
Okay, I'm sharing. Can you guys all see that now?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. The way we'll do this is if anybody has any questions as we're going through, please just pop them in the chat Ilgar will see them in there and let me know. Feel free to interrupt me if you need me to answer a question as we're going through. Okay, so we'll start off by me saying, who am I? I am the owner of a company called Academy Training Solutions, and we're based in the UK, but we do provide training for customers wherever they are. This is one thing that the pandemic has been good for, probably the only thing, is doing online training. People have suddenly realized that actually they can learn stuff from online. And so it means that we can actually train customers from all around the world. And we can also get trainers from anywhere in the world to do that training. So we can get the best trainers and we can train customers wherever they are. We do staff training for corporates predominantly. I also do consultancy for BI, and I'm a MOS master, even though MOS master doesn't exist anymore. So I'm now considered a MOS expert rather than a MOS master. And on the right-hand side is a list of all the different certificates that I've done over the years for MOS. But essentially, I'm a hobbyist and an amateur. So although I do training for Microsoft Office and Power BI and Power Tools, really I treat it as a hobby. I really enjoy doing it. And the word amateur comes from the origin of the word is to love. So don't ever put people down if they say they're an amateur. Professionals do it for money. Amateurs do it for love. There's just a close-up of a list of all the courses. Okay, what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk today about data, but specifically, what do we do with our data? You've probably all come across the different statistics that say we've had as much data stored in the last 2 years as we have had ever before in history. Yeah, that's probably true, but it depends who you listen to. Some people say it's as much in the last 2 years. Some people say as much this year. Who knows? But it's a lot. We have a lot of data. So what do we have to do with our data other than just bring up fancy videos of the Matrix? So data is data is data. Data is all of the numbers. It's all the information that's stored electronically that we work with. And that's the first thing we need to do. We need to store it. So the data needs to be stored somewhere. And once we've got that done properly, and we then need to allow people access. In fact, we need to do more than that. We need to control the access. So some people are allowed access and most people are not allowed access. But even when we get that right, still, what have we done that for? Well, the people who are allowed access need to do some analysis. There is no point in us having all this data unless we can actually do analysis on it and look at the data and get some intelligence out of the data. The last stage of that is the visualization. So we need to share this with other people. We don't just do it for ourselves. So we do the analysis on the data and we're then going to share it with other people. And that then comes into what we call the reporting side of things. So this is really what we're going to look at today. So the business intelligence or data analysis reports. These don't show people the data. There is no point putting the data in front of an end user because it's going to be too much. Even if we have 200 rows of data, if it's too much to show on a screen, it's too much. People can't understand it. People can't comprehend it. So we need to show people a summary of the data, not the data itself. And we also need to show them just what's relevant to them. Now, it might be to them as a manager, just seeing the data that's to do with their department, or it might be just the relevant data to do with a question that they want to ask about the business. So just relevant data. So what do we do to summarize data? Well, in a nutshell, we do some form of aggregation. So aggregation might be a word that some people don't know, but aggregation is a way of summarizing the data. So, for example, we could count how many transactions we have had if we wanted to see how many. We could add them together. We could use sum if we wanted to see how much money they were all worth. Both of these are ways of aggregation. and both of them are valid, but both of them give us different answers. For example, if we've got a salesperson called Joe and they make one single sale, but that sale is for £6,000. We have another salesperson called Mary. She makes 6 sales, but the combined value is only £5,500. Who is the better salesperson? Well, we don't know. The data itself doesn't tell us. The data and any visuals that we create will only tell us the numbers. They'll tell us how many, or they'll tell us the total amount of the value. So we need to add in other things as well. We need to add in other factors into the analysis. How many hours are they working? What's the profit on the sales? Not what's the value of the sales, but what's the profit on the sales? How much are the salespeople being paid? And so on. There's lots and lots of other factors to take into account rather than just the raw numbers. And what we must be careful of is when we put just the raw numbers in a visual and put it in front of an audience, do they understand what they're seeing? When we say just the relevant data, well, this is just filtering. That's really what we're going to focus most of today on, is looking at Power BI and all the different ways that I can think of that we can filter our data in Power BI. For example, a manager might just be interested in their team. They don't want to see the data across the whole company. They just want to see their team. So we can filter by their team. We might want to look at it and say, there's no point. We have all the data from the last 15 years, but we don't want that. We just want the data from this year and the previous year. So we'd filter it so we can see just that. We might want to filter group by staff versus contractors, all sorts of other things. But all of these are just different ways of applying a filter. So what? Well, we're going to look in Power BI and we're going to look at different ways of doing these aggregations. So first of all, I'm going to show you that we can create a very simple implicit calculation where the machine guesses what we wanted by the implication of what we do. That's called implicit. This is actually really bad. You should try and avoid these. So we'll then take it on and we'll talk about explicit, where we have specifically said, do this kind of aggregation. That's much better, and I'll explain why as well. We're then going to take a look at a whole variety of different ways we can do filters, when we can apply them, where within the data process, and why we might be better to apply them at one point rather than another. And that's all we're going to do. Like I said, I'll be happy to take questions as we're going through. But for now, let's get started. I'm going to bring up my Power BI. And the first thing we're going to look at is, as I said, implicit versus explicit measures. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's take, for example, this column here, which is the value of each transaction. Now, if I were to say that we have 19,000 rows of data here, 19,000 transactions, that's quite difficult to just put in front of somebody and say, okay, here's the data. That's the report you wanted. That's not what we want to do. We need to somehow summarize this data. So what I'm going to do here is take that value column and just simply check the box next to it. That will put it on the screen in a visual. I don't like that visual, so I'm going to change it. And I'm just going to change it into a card, multi-row card. So we can now see that we have a value. And what it's actually done is that is not the value of all of the items in that column. That has made an implicit or an implied function, which is to add them all together. So that has added together all of the values in that column. We didn't tell it to add them. We just said, put them in a visual. And the way we can see this is we can come across here to the fields and we click on the drop down and we can see that the implicit function is the sum. Now we can, of course, change it to any of these other aggregation methods. We can say, what's the average transaction, for example? What is the largest? What's the smallest? And these are all just different ways of aggregation. And you'll know what you want to see from your data. Now, we can also say, don't summarize. That is what we told it to do. We didn't actually tell it to do the summary. But what that does is that will now show me every single transaction. And clearly with 19,000, that's going to be too many to scroll down. So we definitely do want to do some sort of aggregation. But what we don't want is we don't want the machine deciding what that aggregation should be. Now, the default is that if we take a value field, in other words, it has a number stored within each of the cells in that column, when we drag it in, the default will be to do the sum. So that is the implied measure. Now, what are the advantages of this? Well, speed. It's very quick and easy to do. That's the speed of you building it. But the speed of processing is actually much slower, because every time somebody comes to this page to view this page, that calculation needs to be worked out, because it's not stored in a function anywhere. Now, if we had written a measure, which is an explicit measure rather than an implicit measure, the answer to that calculation would be stored in memory. And then every time someone came to this page, they'd just be fed the answer from memory instead of having to do the calculation again. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but if we have various calculations, like if we had that value split over different categories, that might be 10 or 20 different calculations, which for every single person who views this page, that does add up to quite a lot of time, especially when the website is busy for viewing the page. So how do we do an explicit measure? Well, we simply create a measure that says what we want it to do. So here I made a new measure. Instead of taking the value column, I took the value column here and I said, give me the sum of the value column. And I've called that total sales, and I've set the decimal places on that as well. Now, how does this differ to the implicit measure? Well, firstly, when I've used it, then it is stored in memory. So the answer for that calculation is now stored in memory and therefore will be accessed much, much faster. It is exactly the same number that we see here. So there is no difference in the number itself. The big difference is in two things. One is that some much more advanced functions will not work with implicit measures. They rely on having explicit measures. And the other is that it's stored in memory, and therefore it's retrieved faster. If you're not doing it already, you should get out of the habit of using implied measures and always define a measure for everything that you do as your aggregation. Now, what else can we do? Well, if we have this visual selected, we can go to value, which is the implied measure, and we can click on the drop down and we could choose the different aggregations if we wanted. Whereas if we go to our total sales, which is the explicit measure, we don't have any of those options here because the method of aggregation is defined within the measure. It's defined as being the sum or being the average or whatever we wanted it to be. Okay, let's just move on to the next thing. So we're going to start looking at all the different ways that we can do the filtering. And the first thing we're going to look at is, well, actually, the first thing in the life of our data is going to be the query. And we should try and reduce the amount of data coming in through the query. Let's have a look at what I mean by that. So if I go into the query itself here, and I'm just going into my transactions query, I've actually got this query pointing to a folder. And in that folder, we have loads of different files with different file types in there. And this is a repository folder. So we're imagining that over time, more and more files are going to get put in this folder, which are to do with my data. So what does that mean? Well, we've only got 20,000 rows at the moment. We could very soon have, hundreds of thousands or even millions of rows of data. But if we only ever want to look at the last 4 years worth of data, we don't need to load in all of these rows of data. We can filter them out before we load them in. And that makes everything work much faster within Power BI, especially within the Power Query. So how do we do that? Well, all we've done here is we've done a few things to filter out, to just get rid of the files that we don't want. I've selected it so that I've only got the ones that start with a year number. And now if I turn them into numbers, then the ones that were text file names have now shown as an error, and then I remove the errors. Now at this stage, if I decided that I only wanted the files from the last 4 years, I could sort these and have them sorted descending. So my latest file will be on the top, and then I can tell it to keep only the top few rows of data. So if I only keep the top, let's say 4 rows of data, then I run through all the other steps there, see if they all work. So we get to the end. And now if I come down here and say, show the profiling on the entire data set, when I hover over my headers, we can see that we've halved the amount of data we're loading in to the Power Query. So this is now only loading in 10,000 instead of 19,000. That will make my query process much faster, and it will then make everything in the data model also go faster. Okay, I'm going to remove those couple of steps. So we're back to working with the full bunch of data. And you'll notice I'm just stepping back in time and taking out just those 2 steps that I added for sorting the rows and then keeping the top 4. So now we're back to the entire data set. And if I turn it back, we should now see that we've got the 19,000 rows coming in again. This is the first place you should apply your filtering. So where possible, try and filter out the data before you bring it in. Now, the query here is pointing to a folder. You can do the same if you're getting data from SQL. You can write a query as part of getting the data to exclude what you don't need. This will make your life much, much easier. I had a customer the other day who was trying to bring in 8 million rows and then do the filtering. Wherever possible, do the filtering before you bring the data in. Okay, let's see where else we can do filtering. So once we've brought the data in, what we actually have is we have our data model. And this is the way that the different tables that come in, so the tables are the result of the queries, how do they come in and how do they relate to each other? Now what we have is we have one of these, which is our products here, and we'll see that there's a connection between the products and the facts, which are individual transactions, and on this line that shows how they're related, there is a directional arrow. So that is saying that I can use a category from here to filter all of these. So let's see how that would work. So if we go back into our visualization, here what we have is we have that measure that I created. So my total sales, which is the explicit measure. And that is my total sales for everything, for all of the years of data that I've brought in. But we can say, I want that number, but I want it to take on something which is called row context. So if I were to say, let's take the food category and put that on the axis, that 2 million is now broken down, it's subdivided into these different categories. So in effect, it's filtered, but we're seeing the results of all of the different filter options or all the different buckets, with the aggregation being the sum, because that's what I put in as my measure. So this context filter, this is the row context filter. And if we turned it into, let's say, the matrix or a pivot table, we could have had row and column context on our visual here. So that's the first one to understand, is the first type of filter is the one in the query. The next one, the very simple one, is the row context, but it's still just a filter of the overall value that we worked out with our measure. Now, to take that a stage further, we also have visual filters. Now, some people call these slicers. Technically, they're not actually slicers, and I'll come on to the difference later on. The visual filters are how they interact with other visuals. So if I take something on this visual and click on it, it will affect other visuals on the same page. Now, what I mean by that is if we look at this number here, this is my total sales, 1.95 million. If I just click on refrigerated foods, that will now filter this to just show me the value for what I now have selected. So the filter here, everything I click on in this visual will actually affect every other visual. If I click on breakfast, well, that's where sales for breakfast. Now, this can be really useful. Just recently, they brought out another option where we can actually edit the interactions between visuals. So we don't have to have this going on. Let me just make a duplicate of that one. So I've copied and pasted that visual there. I'll just drag it down. And I'm going to drag it down well below the other visuals so we can see the options that come up above it. And now on the format ribbon, if I go to edit interactions, this is the visual I've got selected. I can edit how it interacts with each of these other two visuals. So for example, I could say, don't interact with this one at all, but do carry on interacting with that one. If I now click on an item to select it, it does interact with this one, but because I've turned it off, it doesn't interact with this one at all. And depending on the visual, there are different interactions that you can have available. Whichever visual I have selected, the other visuals will show how I can interact with them from that visual I have selected. When you are using this, don't forget to turn off the edit interactions when you finish doing it. Okay, I'm going to delete that visual, put this one back up top. And let's move on to proper slicers now. So what do I mean by proper slicers? Well, there is actually a visual called a slicer, and it's that one there, which has the little filter or funnel icon on it. It's called a slicer. Lots of different ways we can use this. So we can just have it, this is the default, which is a vertical list. And we can just have it where we click on something. And again, every other visual by default will be sliced by what we chose. Again, we can edit the interactions just like we did before. But we can do much more than that with our slicer. So we can also click on this drop down here and we can say, show me this as a drop down list. Instead of showing me as a vertical list, it's now a drop down menu. So we can make this take up far less space on the screen. That's useful if you've got not much real estate or you don't want to make it look too complicated. We can, of course, still choose the items here. I'm sure you'll use a better color scheme than I'm using here, so you'll actually see them more clearly. I'm going to change that back to a list again. Where people are used to seeing slices is in Excel. A lot of people are used to using them there and they'd like the Power BI ones to look the same. And you can make them look the same. So what we have to do is we have to, first of all, you have to have this as a list, not as a drop down. And then if you go into the formatting settings and go into general, you can find the orientation. And if you change it to horizontal, this will now appear much more like slicer buttons that you're used to seeing in Excel. I go in and change the colors there just so they come up slightly more clearly, but you will still see them being applied. Okay, I'm going to change that back to vertical. And this is what I call a proper slicer. Now, what's the difference between a visual slicer and a proper slicer? Why didn't I just use a multi-row card here, for example? I can still click on something and it will affect everything else. Well, proper slicers let you actually synchronize the slicer over different pages in your report. So if I go to this page here, I've got my slicer here, which is for the different states. And if I go to my view and sync slicers panel, if I choose this slicer, I can now see which pages that slicer appears on. So I'm going to remove it from that page. I'm going to say I want it on these two pages to be visible, and I also want them to synchronize with each other. So let's just see that. If I now just pop across to the sync slicer 2, we'll see that that is still showing me all of the states. But now if I choose a state from here, I'll choose California. If I now go to the other page, we'll see that California has been chosen here already because the slicer is synchronized across the two pages. Now, where this is really useful is if you decide, yes, we do want it synchronized, but we don't want it visible on all the other pages. So we can say, yes, I do want it to be synchronized, but I don't necessarily want it to be visible on the other page. So now if I go to the other page, we can't see the slicer, but if we look at the numbers, just over 20K and 47,000, that's not showing me everything. If I now change that back to show me all, 1.95 million, if I go back to this page, this is now showing me the 1.95 million, but I can't see the slicer on this page. Now, where this is particularly useful, I've found, is for doing a drill through from one page to another with multiple fields selected. You can't actually do that using the drill through to another page. With the drill through, you can only drill through with one category selected. By doing a synchronized slicer and even having a button that takes you to the page, you can then go to another page with the multiple slicer selection. Okay, let's move on to a measure filter. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, within a measure, we can actually define a filter that will override other filters within the visual, and in fact, other filters within all of the report. What do I mean by that? Well, if I go here to my refrigerated foods, you'll notice that this one, which is my total sales measure, that was the sum of values, that one is being affected by whatever I choose here or by whatever slicer I've chosen. But let's imagine I wanted to see my grand total sales and I didn't want this to change affected by other filters. Now, I could, of course, if it was just the visual filters I didn't want it to interact, I could, of course, just turn them off. But every new visual I put in, the default will be that it does affect that number. So I'd need to go through and turn it off for every visual I put in there. What about if I showed some other filters? We'll come onto these later on. They would affect that number. So we're going to do something in the measure which says, make this be the filter and make it override everything else. And you'll see I've got a measure called grand total sales. And if I click on the grand total sales, we'll see that measure. And this is the calculate function. Calculate you should think of as being the anything if or anything ifs. So rather than just some ifs or count ifs, this is anything if. So any expression you want with a criteria, so with a filter or multiple filters. And you can specify this filter to be everything in a table. In other words, don't filter. You can also specify it to remove filters if you want. There are lots of commands you can use here to do with the filter. I've done a fairly simple one here. So I've done my grand total sales and I've said calculate the total sales, which is this measure here. And the reason I've referred to it is because, well, my machine already has that answer stored in memory. So I'm saying refer to my total sales calculation, but do this for all of my transactions table. In other words, do it for this entire table. And by the nature of me doing that, it means it will not apply any other filters. So that filter within the formula, within the measure, will override any other filters. So that does affect this total sales one because that's just a straightforward sum, doesn't have the calculate. This grand total is wrapped in the calculate function with its own filter, and that own filter overrides all of these visual filters. Okay, what else can we do within the measure filters? Well, this one here, previous year sales, I've done something similar. So let's have a look at that one. If I go to my previous year sales measure, I've also used the calculate function. And I've also used my total sales. But for my filter, I've said, take whatever the date is in the row context and go back a year. So take off 1 year from all of the dates in here. In fact, from that entire date field. So my value here for January 2016 matches exactly my value for 2015. So my previous year sales have now been calculated very easily. And this is previous year sales with the context of whatever is in the row on the left-hand side. So previous year here is previous year from 2016 is my whole of my 2015 year sales. That then is very useful because it lets us do other calculations like growth within a period. And the period can be whatever you like, whatever you can put down here. You could put down financial years, you can put down actual years, months, quarters, whatever you want, because it just says take that period and take it minus a year and give me the numbers. We also have a year to date. So if I go to my year to date sales, this is a similar one, but it's actually a year to date, total year to date function. Very similar though, because all we do is we do the calculation for total sales, but then we say, look for my date column, and it gives me the year to date. So what we end up with is here, my year to date sales in January 2015 is the same as my actual sales in 2015. My year to date sales in February is my January plus my February. My year to date sales in March, January plus February plus March. Okay, so I think you'll see that we have multiple different ways we can apply just a simple filter within the measure itself to give us different answers. Now we can take this a stage further because we can also have multiple filters within an entire page. So the page that we're looking at here is just going to be this page, and we have a visual, just a one visual on the page. So if I select the visual and then open up this filter pane, I can see all of the items I have built into this visual appear here. And I can apply settings or filters on any of the items that are already in here. I can also add in extra fields. That's all to do with the visual. As soon as I click away from the visual, if I have no visual selected, I can apply filters to two different areas. I can apply them to the entire page, or I can apply them to the entire report. Now, my thinking would be, if you're going to apply it to the entire report, which is all pages, why didn't you filter it out in the Power Query? Because then you'd be working with less data, so everything would run much faster and much smoother. So there might well be reasons, but if there aren't, you're probably better off filtering it out in the query rather than filtering it at this stage on all pages. If you want it to filter just this one page, there are some specific filters you might want to use. And I find the most useful one is some of the recently added date filters. Now, in order for them to work, you do have to put a date field into this data field here. So I'm going to take my date time field and drag it into there. And what we have here is we now have different options. We can just go through basic checkboxes, but because it's identified as a date time field, we can use this one here, which is a relative date, which is quite useful because we can now say, show these items in the last or in the next, most commonly used in the last. And let's say 3 years. So this will show me data that I've got within the last 3 years, include today, and I apply the filter. And now we see it only goes back as far as 2018. And because I've said 3 years include today, it only goes back 3 times 365 from today's date. Now, if I actually said go back 3 calendar years, then it will exclude this year and it will go back 3 entire calendar years from January 18, 19, and 20. But I have no data for 21. I do have my previous year's sales for 21 because that's not the data in this year. That's last year's data. Okay, I'm going to remove that filter just by clicking the eraser there to clear it before I actually remove the filter. If you are using this, just remember that if you click on the visual, you have the visual selected. You then have the options for that particular visual. You will have a filter option for every field that you've added, every measure or column that you've added into that visual. And you'll have another one underneath where you can add extra fields should you desire. Underneath there, you then have the option to put filters on this page. And then underneath there, you have the option for filters on all pages. Like I say, do think about what's the best way for you to actually do this, though. Right, another way that we can apply filters. This is something that might surprise people. This is probably the most secure way of applying a filter, and it's called row level security. It's actually a security setting rather than a filter setting, but it does use a filter when it does it. So what I've done here is I've got my row level security page, and I have my grand total sales and my total sales, and I have various other visuals on here. Now, as you'll remember, the grand total sales, that is built into the measure. The fact of the filter is built into the measure. So every other filter that we use, every other visual that we use, it will not affect that grand total sales. But for those who know, when we actually publish Power BI, we publish it to the server, our PBX file is broken into two parts. It's broken into a data set and the report. Now, the data set is what actually gets the row level security applied to it. Now, the row level security will filter out the rows that we specify before it ever feeds that data to the report. And it does this based on who has logged in. So if somebody logs in and we've assigned them a role and we've filtered rows for that role, that person will never, ever get data that we've filtered out. So this number here, this grand total, will be based upon the grand total sales for their data. In other words, for what they're allowed to see. So it will not be the overall master grand total for the whole organization. That's something to be aware of because a lot of people think that it's going to give them that. So how do we apply row level security? Well, we need to create the roles. We do that in modeling. We're going to manage roles. And all I've done is I've set up one here for Fred from Casio. And the filter that we've applied is we're saying, well, Fred is from Casio, so he should only see the data to do with Casio tills. So we're going to go to the tills. We're going to add a filter. And the filter that's been added is where the make equals Casio. So that's the filter that's been applied for Fred on all of Fred's data. I'm going to click Save. Remember, that is applied when Fred logs in. The data set will only feed Fred's data to the visual that Fred is viewing. So if I go back here, we'll see that if we chose our tills and we chose the make equaling Casio, that will filter in this direction and it will filter our facts. So Fred will never get any information other than the Casio data. Let's have a look at how this works. So we have the option to view as, even without publishing, we can view as if we'd logged in as Fred from Casio. Now, what we'd expect is you'd expect not to see any of the other makes down here. And for this one to be considerably smaller, not 0.8 million, all these other numbers to be much smaller, and for that number also to have been filtered down to Casio only. If I take this further and I see refrigerated foods for Casio tills, that does apply the filter on this one. It doesn't apply the filter on the grand total because this will always be all of the transactions table. But what we're seeing now is that the transactions table itself has been filtered before it's sent to this report by the row level security. Okay, I'm going to stop viewing. And I'm going to come out of my Power BI just briefly. And I'm going to say that was a very quick fly through looking at different ways we can apply filters, different types of filter and why we might apply different filters in different places within Power BI. Clearly think about it first of all. Put your filters in Power Query if you can. If you don't need the extra data, don't bring it in. Otherwise, understand there's lots of different places you can put the filters in and have a go and see how they work for you. Other than that, thank you for your time. Anybody got any questions or comments?
So,
Anybody there?
thank you, Oakley, for your wonderful presentation session. And I would like to tell you that in the beginning of your session, one guy wrote to me that this is real trainer. He has a full command of diction, you know.
Yeah. Thank you, whoever that was. Let me scroll back and see who that was. Oh, was that from YouTube, was it?
Pardon? No, from here.